Millions of children in the 1960s went to sleep with the Mrs. Beasley doll, the bespectacled, always smiling toy that became a cultural icon. But Anissa Jones, the girl who once held that doll, was living a life slowly being suffocated by that very image. While the plastic doll remained perpetually happy and motionless, frozen in time, the real girl was rapidly crumbling under the immense weight of a stolen childhood, forced to compete with a non-existent version of herself. By 1976, the tragedy reached a bizarre and horrifying climax. The product was devouring people. While the dolls were carefully preserved in collectors' display cases, 18-year-old Anissa was found lifeless in a stranger's bedroom, her body ravaged by drugs she had bought with her remaining allowance. It's a typical Hollywood horror story. A plastic replica survives to become a valuable antique, while the real girl is turned to ashes and scattered into the sea. The story of the girl in the bedroom began on March 11th, 1958, in West Lafayette, Indiana. Anissa Jones was born into a world that prioritized appearances. Her father, John Paul Jones, was an aerospace engineer, a man of intellect and quiet warmth. Her mother, Mary Paula Jones, was a student of the arts, a woman defined by a fierce, driving ambition that exceeded the boundaries of her suburban life. When Anissa was 2 years old, the family moved west to Playa del Rey, California. It was the era of the aerospace boom, and Southern California was the epicenter of the future. But inside the Jones household, the foundation was cracking. The marriage between John and Mary Paula was volatile. They were two people operating on different frequencies. John was grounded, focused on stability. Mary Paula was restless, focused on potential. Anissa grew up in the shadow of this domestic Cold War. She was a shy child. She was not the kind of kid who performed for relatives at dinner parties. She was introverted, preferring to play alone or with her younger brother, Paul. She had a natural solemn quality to her face, a kind of melancholy that sat strangely on a child so young. In 1964, the tension in the house snapped. John and Mary Paula filed for divorce. It was a bitter, scorched earth separation that turned Anissa and Paul into assets to be fought over. The court battle was lengthy and cruel, characterized not by concerns for emotional well-being, but by a struggle for control. In the mid-1960s, family courts heavily favored mothers, viewing them as the default caregivers regardless of the domestic reality. Mary Paula fought aggressively for custody, leveraging these societal norms, and she won. John Paul, the parent Anissa felt safest with, and the one who provided a sense of grounded reality, was relegated to the margins, a weekend visitor in his daughter's life. Mary Paula now had sole control of the household. She needed money, but more than that, she needed validation. She was a woman with artistic pretension but no outlet, stranded in a suburban existence she felt was beneath her. She looked at her daughter and saw something the neighbors didn't. She saw a look. Anissa had large, expressive eyes and natural freckles that gave her a vulnerability that was impossible to manufacture. In Los Angeles, living minutes from the studios, that vulnerability was a commodity. It was a resource waiting to be extracted. Mary Paula found an agent and immediately operationalized her daughter's childhood. She began driving Anissa to auditions, treating the process with the rigor of a job search. It was a numbers game. They went to cattle calls, sitting in waiting rooms filled with hundreds of other mothers and daughters, all desperate for a minute of attention. The atmosphere in these rooms was not creative, it was competitive and suffocating. Mothers scrutinized other children, comparing outfits and hairstyles, looking for a weakness in the competition. Anissa was 6 years old. She didn't ask to be an actor. She had no burning desire to perform. She followed orders. She stood where she was told to stand. She smiled when she was told to smile. She learned early that affection and approval were conditional on her ability to follow direction. Her first job was a commercial for a breakfast cereal. It was quick, easy money, but crucially, it provided proof of concept. It validated Mary Paula's instinct that Anissa was marketable. The industry liked Anissa because she lacked the polished, synthetic veneer of the typical Hollywood kid. She wasn't polished or fake. She was readable. She projected a genuine need for protection that made adults want to take care of her. Casting directors saw a blank slate onto which they could project a specific type of American innocence. In 1965, producers Don Feddersen and Edmund Hartman were struggling to cast a new sitcom for CBS titled Family Affair. The concept was high-concept domestic fantasy. A wealthy bachelor civil engineer living in a Manhattan penthouse with his English butler, suddenly saddled with his brother's 3 orphan children. The show was engineered to be a ratings hit, combining the fish-out-of-water trope with sentimental family dynamics. They had cast the gruff but lovable Brian Keith as Uncle Bill and the distinctively British Sebastian Cabot as Mr. French. They had found the teenager, Sissy, and the boy, Jody, but they couldn't find Buffy. The producers needed a specific archetype. Buffy had to be cute, but not cloying. She had to be precarious. She had to convincingly play a child who had lost her parents, a child who clung to a rag doll as her only source of security. This was a difficult balance to strike. If the child was too precocious, the audience would find her annoying. If she was too sullen, the show would lose its comedic tone. They saw hundreds of girls. None of them worked. They were too polished, too Hollywood, too happy. They were trained performers who knew how to hit a mark but didn't know how to project genuine loss. Then, Anissa Jones walked into the room. The story of her audition has become Hollywood folklore, but stripped of the romance, it reveals the reality of her appeal. Anissa was tired. She didn't want to be there. She had been dragged from audition to audition by a mother who viewed success as the only option. As she stood in front of the producers, she was fidgeting. The producers asked her a question, and instead of delivering a rehearsed line with a stage school smile, Anissa looked down and lifted her skirt to show them a scraped knee she had gotten on the playground earlier that day. It was unscripted. It was real. It was a moment of uncalculated interaction that cut through the artifice of the casting process. Producer Don Feddersen saw it immediately. That lack of artifice was exactly what the camera needed. She wasn't acting like a sad little girl. She was a sad little girl. They signed her immediately. Production began in 1966. Anissa was 8 years old. She was thrust into a grueling industrial environment. Television production in the 1960s was a factory system. They were churning out nearly 30 episodes a season, a pace that is almost unheard of in modern television. The schedule was relentless. Anissa would wake up before dawn. She would be driven to the studio. She would sit in a makeup chair while adults applied foundation to her face, masking the natural skin of a child with products designed for the harshness of studio lighting. She would spend hours under hot lights, hitting marks, repeating lines, waiting for lighting setups, and then doing it all over again. The physical environment of a soundstage is disjointed and disorienting. It is a windowless box where time is manipulated by the assistant director. For an adult, it is exhausting. For a child, it is developmentally stunting. There was a school on set, but it was a legal formality. Education was squeezed into the gaps between takes, often in 15-minute increments. The priority was the footage. The priority was the schedule. If Anissa was tired, if she was cranky, if she just wanted to go outside and play, It didn't matter. The machine had to keep moving. The production budget cost thousands of dollars an hour. The emotional state of the lead actress was secondary to the bottom line. Family Affair premiered in September 1966. It was an instant, massive success. It shot to the top of the Nielsen ratings, anchoring CBS's powerhouse lineup. The chemistry between Anissa and Johnny Whitaker, who played her twin brother Jody, was electric. But it was Anissa who captured the cultural zeitgeist. She became the focal point of the show's emotional arc. Buffy became more than a character. She became a brand. The marketing machine of the late 60s went into overdrive. Mattel released the Mrs. Beasley doll, a replica of the prop Anissa carried on the show. It became the best-selling doll in the United States. You could not walk into a department store in 1967 without seeing Anissa's face staring back at you. Her image was licensed for lunchboxes, coloring books, clothing lines, and paper dolls. She was a piece of intellectual property that generated millions of dollars in revenue for CBS and the merchandising partners. For Mary Paula Jones, this was the victory she had chased. The money rolled in. The checks were substantial. The family moved to a bigger house. They had status. Mary Paula became a fixture on the set, the classic stage mother who managed her daughter's career with an iron grip. She controlled the schedule. She controlled the interviews. She controlled the finances. She positioned herself as the gatekeeper to Anissa, ensuring that every request, every contract, and every dollar went through her. The dynamic in the Jones household shifted permanently. Anissa was no longer just a daughter. She was the primary economic engine of the family. But for Anissa, the success was a cage. Fame for a child is a distorting mirror. Everywhere she went, people didn't see Anissa. They saw Buffy. Strangers would approach her in the grocery store and pick her up without asking. They would pull her pigtails to see if they were real. They would ask where Mrs. Beasley was, treating the prop as a living entity. They demanded she perform the character for them right there in the aisle. The boundaries between her private self and her public persona were obliterated. She was public property, an object to be consumed by an adoring but intrusive audience. She began to dissociate. There was Anissa, the quiet girl who liked to draw and missed her dad, and there was Buffy, the national asset who belonged to everyone else. The lines began to blur. On set, she was rewarded for being dependent, for being small, for being helpless. Off set, she was the primary breadwinner for her family. She was an 8-year-old carrying the mortgage. This inversion of the parent-child dynamic created a deep-seated confusion. She was powerful enough to support her mother, yet powerless to choose her own bedtime. The dynamic on the set of Family Affair was warm, but it was a workplace. Brian Keith was protective of the children, establishing a strict 5 p.m. quit time to try and preserve some normalcy for them. But he was an adult with his own life. Sebastian Cabot was kind, but he was a colleague. Anissa's social circle was restricted to the adults she worked with. She didn't have a peer group. She didn't have sleepovers with friends who didn't care about ratings. Her reality was the soundstage. Her friends were teamsters, makeup artists, and camera operators, adults who were paid to be there. By season 4, the camera began to capture something the makeup couldn't hide. Anissa was growing up. This biological reality was the production's nightmare. The fatigue in her eyes was visible, but the bigger problem was her changing silhouette. She was no longer a child, yet she was contractually obligated to remain one. The producers weren't just fighting ratings, they were fighting nature itself. By 1969 and 1970, Anissa was entering adolescence. Biology was taking its course. She was growing taller and her body was developing. This natural progression was viewed by the producers not as a milestone, but as a continuity error. The character of Buffy was frozen in time, a perpetual 6-year-old. To maintain the illusion, the production team resorted to physical suppression. They bound her chest with tight fabric to hide the early signs of breast development. They kept her in short dresses with high waistlines, designed for toddlers, even as she approached her teenage years. They manipulated the camera angles, often shooting her from above or placing her in oversized furniture to make her appear smaller than she was. While other girls her age were experimenting with fashion and identity, Anissa was forced into the costume of her own childhood. This enforced infantilization created a profound psychological dissonance. Anissa was being told that her value lay entirely in her ability to remain a child. Growing up was not a natural process, it was a career threat. Every inch she grew, every change in her voice was a problem to be solved by the wardrobe and camera departments. By 1969, the culture outside the studio walls was burning. Woodstock happened, the Manson murders happened, the Vietnam War was escalating. But on stage 2 at CBS, it was always 1955. Anissa was trapped in a time capsule, playing out sanitized domestic problems while the real world exploded. The cultural dissonance was absolute. While teenagers across America were growing their hair long, protesting the draft, and engaging in a radical redefinition of societal norms, Anissa was contractually obligated to remain in a state of suspended animation. She was a living artifact of a dying era, forced to embody an Eisenhower-era innocence that the rest of the country was actively dismantling. Every Monday morning she walked into a sound stage that hermetically sealed out the counterculture, tasked with solving problems that could be fixed with a stern look from Mr. French or a piece of advice from Uncle Bill. She was becoming an anachronism before she even hit her teens. As Anissa entered adolescence, the walls of the Playa del Rey house closed in. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about autonomy. While other teenagers were rebelling, Anissa was petitioning her employee, her mother, for permission to live. The resentment wasn't just financial, it was existential. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the cage was shrinking. She was the engine of the household, yet she possessed less freedom than the average American teenager. The dynamic had become toxic. She was the financier of the family's survival, yet she possessed less freedom than a prisoner in her own home. The financial arrangement was opaque. While Anissa generated thousands of dollars a week, her daily reality was one of allowance and restriction. She saw the new cars and the larger house, but she had no access to the capital she was generating. This economic powerlessness fostered a deep sense of frustration. She was working adult hours for a child's pocket money, while her mother managed the empire Buffy had built. The only escape Anissa had was her weekends with her father. John Paul Jones offered a glimpse of normalcy. He lived apart from the frenetic energy of the stage mother lifestyle. At his house, the pressure to perform evaporated. At his house, she wasn't Buffy. She was just Anissa. They would go to the beach. They would sit in silence. These weekends were not filled with expensive outings or industry parties. They were defined by a quiet, grounded domesticity that Anissa craved. Her father did not care about ratings or residuals. He cared about his daughter. But the clock was always ticking. The dread of Sunday afternoon was palpable. Sunday night always came. She had to go back to Mary Paula. She had to go back to the studio. She had to put the pigtails back in. In 1970, Family Affair was still pulling in decent ratings, but the demographics were skewing old. The television landscape was shifting under their feet. The network executives were beginning to pivot away from the rural, escapist comedies that had defined the 60s. shows like The Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, and Family Affair. CBS was looking at the future. They wanted shows like MASH and The Mary Tyler Moore Show. They wanted relevance. They wanted the urban, young, disposable income demographic that advertisers coveted. The gentle, saccharine world of Uncle Bill and Buffy was becoming a liability. It represented the past, a television style that felt increasingly out of touch with a polarized, cynical America. The cast and crew finished filming the 5th season in early 1971. Everyone expected to be back for a 6th. The ratings were solid enough to justify renewal in a traditional model. The storylines were open. The contracts were standard. Anissa went on her summer break, assuming her life would resume its rigid shape in the fall. She prepared for another year of tutoring on set, another year of pigtails, and another year of being America's sweetheart. She was wrong. The cancellation of Family Affair in the spring of 1971 was not a soft landing. It was an execution. CBS didn't cancel the show because the audience had left. They canceled it because they wanted a new audience. The network was undergoing the infamous rural purge, a massive strategic shift orchestrated by network president Fred Silverman. It was a bloodbath for comfort television. Silverman and the executives decided to cut loose shows that appealed to older rural demographics in favor of urban, sophisticated content. It was a cold demographic calculation. Family Affair, with his gentle morality and orchestral score, was deemed obsolete. The executives in New York didn't care about the ratings. They looked at the spreadsheets, drew a red line through the production, and moved on. For 13-year-old Anissa, the decision was absolute. There was no farewell episode, no wrap party to celebrate. A job well done. There was no closure. The routine that had defined her existence since she was 8 years old simply evaporated. The soundstage doors were simply locked. The surrogate family she had spent every day with for 5 years was dissolved by a memo. The relationships on a film set are intense but transactional. They exist only as long as the production exists. Brian Keith moved on to his next project. Sebastian Cabot went back to voice work and theater, but Anissa was sent home to Playa del Rey with nothing but a severance of routine. The psychological impact of this sudden stop cannot be overstated. Anissa had been institutionalized by the studio system. Her sense of self-worth, her daily structure, and her social interactions were all tied to the show. Without the call sheet, she was adrift. The transition from national treasure to unemployed 8th grader is a psychological precipice few adults could navigate, let alone a child entering the volatile chemistry of puberty. Anissa returned to the public school system, a brutal environment for anyone who stands out. She didn't just stand out, she was a walking target. Westchester High School in the early 70s was not a sanctuary. It was a social Darwinist experiment. It was a large, chaotic public school teeming with the specific cruelty of teenagers. Anissa entered this environment with a target on her back. She was not entering as an anonymous student. She was entering as a celebrity, but a celebrity of a very specific, vulnerable type. When Anissa walked through the hallways, she wasn't treated with awe. She was treated as a curiosity, then as a joke. The students didn't see Anissa Jones. They saw Buffy. They saw the pigtails. They saw the doll. The character that had made her rich became a weapon used against her. The bullying was multifaceted. There was the class resentment. She was mocked for being rich, though she had no access to her own money. She drove a perception of privilege that alienated her from working-class students. Yet she had none of the freedom that wealth usually provides. She was taunted for the childishness of her TV persona. High school is a place where students are desperate to appear mature, cool, and adult. Anissa represented the opposite. She was the face of childhood, of dolls, of safety. To be associated with her was to be uncool. The boys were interested in her for the wrong reasons, bragging rights that they had talked to the girl from TV. The girls viewed her with suspicion and jealousy. She was isolated in a crowd, surrounded by peers but devoid of friends. She retreated inward, her natural shyness hardening into a defensive shell. She began to cut classes, not to rebel, but to escape the relentless, grinding humiliation of being a celebrity in a cafeteria. Her mother, Mary Paula, did not understand this dynamic. She viewed the situation through a financial lens, not an emotional one. To Mary Paula, the cancellation was a financial crisis. The cash flow that had sustained their upper-middle-class lifestyle had been severed. The mortgage, the cars, the lifestyle, it all depended on Anissa working. Mary Paula did not see a traumatized teenager who needed a break. She saw an unemployed asset. She needed Anissa to work. She pushed her daughter back into the audition circuit, expecting the industry to welcome its former darling with open arms. But Hollywood has a short memory and a ruthless eye for aging. The industry that had adored Anissa at age 8 found her puzzling at age 13. Anissa walked into casting offices and faced a new, colder reality. She was no longer the cute 8-year-old with the missing front teeth. She was a teenager. She was growing breasts. Her face was thinning out. She didn't look like Buffy anymore, but she didn't look like a woman yet. She was stranded in the uncanny valley of adolescence, that unmarketable gap between child star and leading lady. This is the awkward phase that kills the careers of most child actors. Producers want children to be cute, or they want adults to be sexy. They have little use for the transition. Anissa was entering rooms where she was judged solely on her physical evolution. She was subjected to the clinical, dehumanizing gaze of casting directors who would discuss her changing body as if she were not in the room. The feedback was blunt. She was too associated with the character. Casting directors couldn't look at her without seeing the sitcom. She was typecast, a professional death sentence. Every time she read for a dramatic role, the producers shook their heads. They knew that if they put Anissa Jones on screen, the audience would laugh or get distracted. The illusion of the new character would be broken by the recognition of the old one. "There's Buffy," the audience would say. Her fame was not an asset, it was baggage. She was competing against unknown actresses who had the advantage of anonymity. They could be anyone the script required. Anissa could only be Anissa. In 1972, Anissa stood before the only door that could have led to a second act, The Exorcist. Director William Friedkin was casting for Regan McNeil, the innocent girl possessed by a demon. It was the most coveted and controversial role in Hollywood. For Anissa, it represented a nuclear option. It was the perfect murder weapon for Buffy. To play Regan, to curse, to vomit, to be corrupted, would be to violently and definitively shatter the porcelain doll that had trapped her for half a decade. It would prove she could act. It would prove she was not just a prop. Anissa hungered for this role. She needed to shock the world into seeing her as an actress, not an artifact. She auditioned. She wanted to show the darkness she felt inside, the anger at her mother, the frustration with the industry. She wanted to channel her own trauma into the character. But Hollywood operates on a cruel, internal logic. The executives shook their heads. They didn't reject Anissa because she lacked the talent to play the possessed. They rejected her because she had played the innocent too well. The studio logic was simple and devastating. The audience had a parasocial relationship with Buffy. They viewed her as their own child. To see Anissa Jones tied to a bed, spewing profanity and green bile, would be too disturbing for the general public. It would bridge the gap between entertainment and genuine horror in a way the studio wasn't willing to risk. They needed a girl the audience didn't know, a girl they could believe was possessed without the baggage of 5 years of heartwarming sitcom history. They knew the American audience could not psychologically handle seeing Buffy defiled. Her past success became a future death sentence. When the role went to Linda Blair, a blank slate with no baggage, Anissa understood the message. She wasn't fired for being bad. She was fired for being a symbol that wasn't allowed to be tarnished. The door to her rebirth was locked from the outside. The rejection was a devastating confirmation of Anissa's fears. The industry that had built her up had also built the walls of her prison. She wasn't allowed to change. She wasn't allowed to grow. She was expected to remain a static image of innocence, even as her body and mind matured. As her career stalled, her home life disintegrated. The friction with Mary Paula escalated from teenage annoyance to toxic warfare. Mary Paula was accustomed to managing a compliant child employee. She did not know how to parent a frustrated, unemployed teenager. She tightened her grip. She monitored Anissa's movements. She criticized her appearance. The house in Playa del Rey became a pressure cooker of resentment. The conflict in the Jones household was not merely a clash of personalities. It was a structural failure of a business relationship that had masqueraded as a family dynamic for nearly a decade. For 5 years, the hierarchy had been clear. Mary Paula was the executive, and Anissa was the talent. When the show was canceled and the revenue stream dried up, the power dynamic did not shift to accommodate Anissa's maturation. Instead, it calcified into a rigid, suffocating authoritarianism. Mary Paula, fearing the loss of control over both her daughter and the family's financial future, instituted a regime of domestic surveillance. She viewed Anissa's natural teenage desire for autonomy not as a developmental milestone, but as a breach of contract. The arguments were circular and exhausting. They echoed off the walls of a house that had been purchased with the money Anissa earned but was not allowed to touch. Every request to leave the house, to see friends, or to buy clothes became a high-stakes negotiation that Anissa was destined to lose. Mary Paula began to police Anissa's body and behavior with the scrutiny of a studio executive protecting a depreciating asset. She criticized Anissa's weight, her skin, her posture, and her choice of friends. She was desperate to preserve the image of Buffy and Amber, seemingly unaware or indifferent to the fact that the girl inside the character was suffocating. The house in Playa del Rey ceased to be a home in any functional sense. It became a facility where Anissa was managed, and the management was failing. The psychological toll on Anissa was immense. She was living in a state of suspended animation, treated like a child who could not be trusted with the basic freedoms of adolescence, yet expected to bear the weight of her mother's disappointed ambitions. The resentment she felt was not just teenage angst. It was a deep, systemic anger at having been used. She had given up her childhood to buy her mother a lifestyle, and now that the work was gone, she was being treated like a liability. The only valve for this pressure was her father, John Paul Jones. He remained the one person who saw Anissa as a human being rather than a failed investment. He was her escape hatch. He was the one who listened to her complaints about her mother without judgment. He validated her feelings. He offered a counter-narrative to the rejection she faced in Hollywood. John Paul Jones lived a life detached from the frenetic ambition of his ex-wife. He was an engineer, a man of logic and tangible realities. When Anissa visited him, the conversation did not revolve around callbacks, residuals, or Q scores. It revolved around her art, her schoolwork, and her feelings. He provided a sanctuary where she was allowed to be mediocre, where she was allowed to be tired, and where she was allowed to be imperfect. He did not need her to be famous to love her. This unconditional acceptance was the oxygen Anissa needed to survive the suffocating atmosphere of her mother's house. He was the only adult in her life who did not view her as a commodity. For Anissa, these weekends were not just visits, they were a lifeline. They provided proof that a version of herself existed outside the Buffy persona. Her father's home was a place where the rules were fair and the love was not transactional. He stood as the only barrier between Anissa and the total domination of Mary Paula's will. He was the balance in the equation, the promise that one day she could have a normal life. Then the floor fell out. In 1973, John Paul Jones died of heart failure. It was sudden. It was absolute. Anissa was 15 years old. The death of a parent is a trauma for any child, but for Anissa, it was a structural collapse. Her father wasn't just a parent. He was her shield. He was the buffer between her and the world, between her and her mother. With him gone, she was left defenseless. The grief was compounded by the realization that she was now solely under the legal and physical control of Mary Paula. The timing of the death was catastrophic. Anissa was in the middle of the most turbulent phase of adolescence, already grappling with the loss of her career and identity. Now, she lost her only advocate. The funeral marked the end of her protection. Standing at the grave, Anissa was not just mourning the loss of her father. She was facing the terrifying reality of a future where Mary Paula held all the cards. There were no more weekend escapes. There was no one to call when the fighting in Playa del Rey became unbearable. The monopoly was complete. Mary Paula's reaction to the death of her ex-husband was not to soften toward her daughter, but to harden, perhaps driven by a fear that Anissa would spin out of control without her father's influence, or perhaps seeing an opportunity to consolidate her authority. Mary Paula tightened the screws. The grief in the house was metabolized into conflict. Anissa's sadness was interpreted as sullenness. Her need for space was interpreted as secrecy. The house became a battlefield where two grieving people tore each other apart because they had no other way to communicate. The mourning period turned rapidly into rebellion. This wasn't the performative rebellion of a rock star. It was the desperate thrashing of a trapped animal. Anissa stopped trying to please. She stopped going to auditions. She stopped pretending everything was fine. She began to disappear. She would leave the house for days at a time, staying with friends, sleeping on couches, drifting through the beach cities. She sought out people who didn't care about family affair. She found them in the burgeoning counterculture of the mid-70s, the surfers, the stoners, the dropouts. These kids didn't judge her for losing a role. They judged her on her ability to procure beer or weed. For the first time, she felt a twisted sense of belonging. The geography of her rebellion was specific. She drifted through the beach towns of Los Angeles, Venice, Santa Monica, Playa del Rey. These were communities in transition, places where the hippie idealism of the 60s was rotting into the harder, grittier reality of the 70s drug culture. Anissa fit right in. She was a runaway who wasn't really running away, just drifting out of reach. She found a tribe of lost boys and girls who were also escaping broken homes and broken promises. In this world, being Buffy was a currency, but a strange one. It was a novelty that wore off quickly, replaced by the more immediate currency of rebellion. Anissa learned that if she provided the car or the money for alcohol, she was accepted. It was a transactional friendship, mirroring the transactional love she had received from the industry, but at least here the rules were transparent. She preferred the honest exploitation of the streets to the manipulative exploitation of Hollywood. She began to skip school regularly. Westchester High School had been a place of torment. The beach was a place of freedom. She spent her days sitting on the sand, smoking cigarettes, staring at the Pacific Ocean and trying to numb the pain of her father's death. She was systematically dismantling the good girl image that had been constructed for her. Every missed class, every night spent away from home, every act of defiance was a way of reclaiming ownership of her own life, even if she was destroying it in the process. Mary Paula's response was not empathy, it was enforcement. She saw Anissa's grief and acting out as insubordination. She viewed her daughter's behavior as a threat to the family's reputation and potential future earnings. Instead of family therapy or grief counseling, Mary Paula chose the nuclear option. The conflict reached its zenith in late 1974. Anissa had run away again, staying at a friend's house. Mary Paula knew where she was. A different mother might have gone to the house, sat down, and begged her daughter to come home. A different mother might have realized that the child was screaming for help, but Mary Paula operated on a different logic. She believed that Anissa needed to be broken in order to be fixed. She believed in the authority of the state to correct what she could not control. The irony was acidic. The girl famous for starring in Family Affair, a show about an orphan saved by love, was now living a reality where family was a weapon. When Anissa began to spiral after her father's death, Mary Paula didn't offer therapy. She didn't hug the grief out of her child. She called the police. She reported her own daughter as an incorrigible minor, a legal term that allowed the state to take possession of the child. This legal mechanism is important to understand. Under California law at the time, a parent could declare a child incorrigible or beyond control. This turned teenage rebellion into a status offense. It gave the state the power to arrest and detain a minor who had committed no crime other than disobeying their parents. It was a tool designed for extreme cases, but Mary Paula wielded it like a bludgeon. Visualize the scene. The police arrived at the location where Anissa was staying. They didn't treat her as a celebrity. They treated her as a delinquent. The child star, whom millions of mothers had fantasized about adopting, was handcuffed, stripped of her personal clothes, and thrown into the concrete intake of juvenile hall. The intake process at juvenile hall is designed to dehumanize. It strips away identity. Anissa was forced to shower with delousing soap. She was given a rough institutional uniform. She was assigned a number. The girl who had spent her life in custom-made costumes and makeup chairs was now standing in a cold, fluorescent-lit room surrounded by guards who viewed her with indifference. She was locked in with gang members and street kids, real criminals who looked at the girl from the lunchbox with confusion and disdain. The social hierarchy of juvenile hall was brutal. Anissa was fresh meat. She was the rich girl from TV. She was a target for intimidation and mockery. In that concrete box, her fame offered no protection. It only painted a target on her back. She had to learn to survive quickly. She learned to keep her head down, to make herself small, to hide the terror that was constantly clawing at her throat. For months, Anissa lived in this gray purgatory. She slept on a thin mattress. She ate institutional food. She followed orders barked by guards. But the most devastating part of the experience was the knowledge of who had put her there. Every night as the lights went out and the sounds of the facility settled into a low, menacing hum, Anissa had to confront the fact that her own mother had done this. It wasn't the police, it wasn't the studio, it was her mother. In those cold gray months behind bars, Anissa learned a devastating truth about her existence. Her mother was not her protector, she was her warden. The betrayal was total. It severed the psychological bond between parent and child permanently. Mary Paula had gambled that tough love would shock Anissa back into compliance. Instead, it killed whatever love remained. Anissa realized that she was truly alone in the world. The home in Playa del Rey was just another set, and she had been written out of the script. When she was finally released, the bond with her mother was severed beyond repair. Anissa returned to the house in Playa del Rey, but she was merely biding her time. The dynamic had shifted from active warfare to a cold, deadly silence. They lived like ghosts in the same house, passing each other in the hallways without speaking. Mary Paula had won the battle. She had forced Anissa back under her roof, but she had lost the war. She had a daughter who looked at her with eyes of ice. Anissa was a prisoner, counting down the days to her parole. That parole date was March 11th, 1976, her 18th birthday. Every action she took, every day she endured, was focused on that single point on the calendar. She knew that the moment the clock struck midnight on her birthday, the legal chains would snap. She would have access to her trust fund. She would have legal autonomy. She would be free. The years of 1974 and 1975 were a blur of drift and depression. Anissa dropped out of high school. The educational system had failed her just as the studio system had. Westchester High School had offered her nothing but humiliation, and juvenile hall had interrupted whatever academic progress she might have made. She had no diploma, no job skills, and no desire to return to the humiliating arena of auditions. The idea of going back to Hollywood, of begging for roles from the people who had discarded her, was repugnant. She wanted nothing to do with the industry that had consumed her childhood, but she still had to exist. She was living in the house, but she needed to get out of it as much as possible. She needed a reason to leave in the morning and a reason to stay away until night. She needed a job, not a career. She was done with careers, but a job. Something simple, something mechanical, something that required zero emotional investment. Anissa took the job at Winchell's Donuts not for the money. Her trust fund was mere months away, but as an act of defiance, a desperate bid for anonymity in a polyester uniform. Yet the sanctuary of the service industry was an illusion. Customers didn't see a waitress. They saw a fallen star. The whispers in the line would inevitably turn into public interrogations. "Aren't you Buffy? Why are you wiping tables?" Forcing Anissa to apologize for the crime of growing up. But the darkness was encroaching. During this time, she began to experiment with drugs. It started recreationally. Marijuana, alcohol, the standard lubricants of teenage angst in the 70s. But Anissa had a hole in her soul the size of a father, a career, and a childhood. Soft drugs weren't enough to fill it. She began to gravitate toward a rougher crowd. She met a young man named Alan Coven. Coven was older, drifting, and deeply embedded in the drug subculture. To Mary Paula, he was a nightmare. To Anissa, he was a lifeline. He represented everything her mother hated. He didn't care about Hollywood. He offered an escape that didn't require a script. As her 18th birthday approached, the tension in the Jones household reached a breaking point. Anissa knew about the money. The Coogan law in her contract stipulated that a portion of her earnings had been set aside in a trust fund, along with U.S. savings bonds. The estimated total was somewhere around $180,000. In the economic context of 1976, this was a life-altering fortune. A brand new sports car cost $4,000. A house on the beach cost $40,000. Anissa was about to inherit enough buying power to do anything she wanted. She could have gone to college. She could have traveled to Europe. She could have bought a house and disappeared into a quiet, comfortable anonymity. But money is only a tool, and Anissa had never been taught how to build. She had only been taught how to be consumed. On March 11th, 1976, the clock struck midnight on her childhood. Anissa turned 18. Legally, she was an adult. The trust fund was unlocked. The savings bonds were hers to cash. Mary Paula's legal authority evaporated instantly. Anissa didn't hesitate. She moved out immediately. She rented an apartment near the beach in Ocean Park with her brother Paul. Paul was drifting too, pulled into the same undertow of grief and aimlessness. The siblings, bonded by their shared trauma, created a sanctuary of chaos. She bought a new car, a Ford Pinto. It was a humble choice for a millionaire, but it represented mobility. She had wheels, she had cash, she had no curfew. But freedom without direction is a dangerous vacuum. Anissa had no structure. For 10 years, her schedule had been dictated by assistant directors and school bells. Now there was nothing. No one told her when to wake up. No one told her what to wear. No one told her who to be. The silence of her new life was deafening. To drown it out, she turned up the volume. The apartment became a party hub. The hangers-on arrived. When you are 18, rich and famous, you have a lot of friends. They drank her booze. They crashed on her couch. They validated her existence not as a person, but as a host. And then there was the doctor. Dr. Don Moshos was a general practitioner with a practice in Torrance. In the circles Anissa moved in, his name was whispered as a resource. He was known as a script doctor, a physician who didn't ask too many questions, who viewed the Hippocratic Oath as a loose suggestion. Anissa went to him. She didn't go for a checkup. She went for relief. She complained of anxiety, of sleeplessness, of the crushing weight of her own history. A responsible doctor would have seen the red flags. The trauma, the depression, the recent loss of a parent, the history of acting out. A responsible doctor would have recommended therapy. Moshos grabbed his prescription pad. He wrote her a script for Seconal. Seconal, secobarbital sodium, is a barbiturate derivative drug. In the 70s, it was known on the street as Reds, Red Devils, or Sexies. It is a central nervous system depressant. It slows the brain down. It uncouples the mind from anxiety. It creates a warm, fuzzy numbness that feels like a heavy wool blanket pulled over the soul. It is also incredibly addictive and has a notoriously low therapeutic index. The difference between a dose that gets you high and a dose that stops your heart is terrifyingly small. Anissa took the pill. The noise stopped. The anxiety about her future, the anger at her mother, the grief for her father, it all receded into a soft, manageable blur. It was the peace she had been chasing since the cameras turned off. But the relief was a trap. The tolerance built quickly. She needed more to feel the same numbness. She returned to Moshos. He wrote another script, and another. He added quaaludes to the mix. He was chemically enabling the suicide of a teenager, transaction by transaction. By the summer of 1976, Anissa was losing weight. Her skin was pale. The light in her eyes, already dim, was extinguishing. She was dating Alan Coven seriously now, and their relationship was fueled by the substances they consumed. They were a feedback loop of destruction. She was rich, she was free, and she was dying. The tragedy was that she looked like she was having the time of her life. She was seen at clubs. She was driving her new car up and down the Pacific Coast Highway. She looked like a California dream. But inside the car, the air was thick with smoke and desperation. She cut off almost all contact with her mother. Mary Paula was left in the dark, watching from a distance as the daughter she had manufactured spun out of orbit. There were no more auditions. There were no more residuals. There was only the rapid, efficient burning of the resources Anissa had sacrificed her childhood to earn. August 1976 arrived. The summer was hot and hazy. The bicentennial celebrations had just finished. America was celebrating its 200th birthday, looking forward to a bright future. Anissa Jones was looking at the bottom of a pill bottle. On Friday, August 27th, Anissa and Alan made plans. They were going to a party in Oceanside, a beach town down the coast in San Diego County. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, a teenage getaway. She packed a bag. She got into the car. She didn't know it was the last time she would ever see Los Angeles. She didn't know that the road she was driving didn't have a return lane. She just knew she wanted to get high, and she wanted to forget. The southbound drive on Interstate 5 is a transition between worlds. As the Ford Pinto left the sprawl of Los Angeles behind, it moved away from the industry that had defined Anissa's existence and into the vast, anonymous territory of San Diego County. Oceanside, in 1976, was not a resort destination. It was a military town, anchored by the massive Camp Pendleton Marine Corps base. It was a place of transient populations, cheap motels, and working-class suburbs that felt a universe away from the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills. Anissa drove with the windows down, the warm coastal air masking the scent of the lit cigarettes inside the car. Beside her was Alan Coven, the boyfriend who acted as both companion and conduit to the chemical oblivion she sought. They were not heading to a VIP section or a producer's mansion. They were heading to a modest single-story house on Queensberry Drive. The parents were out of town. It was the oldest setup in the teenage playbook, an empty house, a stash of drugs, and a weekend with no rules. They arrived in the afternoon. The house belonged to the father of a 14-year-old friend of Coven's. The setting was aggressively mundane. Shag carpet, wood paneling, the hum of a refrigerator, the domestic architecture of the very middle-class life Anissa had pantomimed on television for 5 years. But the dynamic here was inverted. She wasn't the child needing protection, she was the financier of the chaos. Anissa brought the supplies. With her trust fund money and her doctor's complicity, she had become a walking pharmacy. She carried a bottle of liquid Seconal, a stash of pills, and cocaine. In the economics of the drug subculture, this made her royalty. She wasn't Anissa Jones, the washed-up child star. She was the girl with the good stuff. The validation she received here was instant and chemical. It was transactional, but to a lonely 18-year-old, it felt close enough to acceptance. As Friday bled into Saturday, the party coalesced into a sloppy, disjointed gathering. The air grew thick with marijuana smoke and the thumping bass of FM radio. At one point, amidst this hazy, aggressive mundanity, Anissa turned to a friend and delivered a line that haunts the history of Hollywood tragedies. "This is the best party of my life." It wasn't a cry of joy. It was the epitaph of a soul that had run out of fuel, that this moment, surrounded by shag carpet and smoke in a stranger's house, represented the pinnacle of her happiness, reveals the absolute depth of her despair. The bar for joy had been lowered to the floor. Throughout the day on August 28th, Anissa's consumption escalated from recreational to suicidal. She wasn't just getting high, she was conducting a chemical assault on her own physiology. She was mixing depressants and stimulants with a reckless disregard for biology. She took Seconal. The barbiturates flooded her system, slowing her heart rate, depressing her respiration, and inducing a heavy, stumbling lethargy. She took Quaaludes. The methaqualone compounded the sedative effect, stripping away motor control and judgment. She snorted cocaine. The stimulant acted as a counterweight, jacking up her heart rate, fighting the sedation, creating a dangerous speedball effect that pulled her cardiovascular system in two opposite directions simultaneously. And she took PCP angel dust, a dissociative anesthetic that detaches the mind from the body, often causing hallucinations and erratic behavior. This wasn't partying. This was erasure. Anissa was systematically shutting down every processing center in her brain. She wanted the noise to stop. She wanted the memory of the auditions, the rejection, the mother, the dead father, the humiliation of the donut shop. She wanted all of it to go black. By late afternoon, the chemicals began to win. The manic energy faded into a slur. Her movements became heavy. The playful Buffy persona she had mocked and fled from was gone, replaced by the blank stare of deep intoxication. Sometime around dinner time, she retreated to one of the bedrooms. She told Coven she was tired. It was a mundane statement, the kind spoken at millions of sleepovers. She walked into the room, closed the door, and lay down on the bed. She never woke up. The mechanism of her death was quiet and internal. As she slept, the levels of seconal and quaaludes in her blood continued to depress her central nervous system, the part of the brain stem that tells the lungs to breathe and the heart to beat began to falter. The cocaine that had been propping her up metabolized and faded, leaving the depressants unopposed. Her respiration slowed, shallow breaths, then gaps in breathing, then silence. There was no dramatic gasp, no thrashing, just a cessation of function. The 18-year-old heart, tired from years of stress and hours of chemical abuse, simply stopped. Outside the door, the party continued. The music played. People laughed. Coven and the others assumed she was sleeping it off. In the logic of the drug den, passing out is normal. You let them sleep. You don't call for help. You don't ask questions. The sun went down. The party wound down. People crashed on couches or drifted away. The house grew quiet. Anissa lay in the dark, her body cooling, the pigtails of her childhood a lifetime away. The morning of August 29th, 1976, brought the harsh, uncompromising light of a Southern California summer. The marine layer burned off early, leaving the sky a brilliant, indifferent blue. Inside the house on Queensberry Drive, the air was stale. Around 11 a.m., Alan Coven woke up. The fog of the previous night was lifting, replaced by the dull ache of a hangover. He went to check on his girlfriend. He opened the bedroom door. The scene was still. Anissa hadn't moved. She was in the exact position he had left her. He called her name. No answer. He walked to the bed. He touched her arm. The temperature of a body that has been dead for 12 hours is unmistakable. It is a coldness that seeps into the hand of the living, a physical shock that overrides any denial. Coven panicked. The reality of the situation crashed into the self-preservation instinct of a drug user. There were drugs in the house. There was a dead girl. This was a felony scenario. But the finality of death forced his hand. The paramedics were called. When the ambulance arrived, the EMTs rushed into the house, dodging the debris of the party. They entered the bedroom. It was a formality. There was no life to save. Rigor mortis had set in. The lividity, the pooling of blood, indicated she had been dead for a long time. They pronounced her dead at the scene. Then came the police. The Oceanside Police Department treated the scene as a standard overdose investigation. They secured the room. They bagged the evidence, the empty pill bottles, the liquid seconal, the drug paraphernalia. They looked at the girl on the bed. They didn't know who she was. This is the final cruel irony of Anissa Jones's life. The face that had been broadcast into 20 million homes, the face that had launched a merchandising empire, was unrecognized in death. The context was wrong. The police saw a Jane Doe, a wasted junkie in a dirty room. They didn't see America's sweetheart. The degradation was total. It wasn't until the coroner's investigator arrived that the truth began to surface. They found an ID card in a purse near the bed. The name on the card, Anissa Jones, seemed impossible given the state of the body. Skeptical, they ran her fingerprints to confirm. The match came back positive, and the shock wave began to ripple outward. The autopsy report provided the chemical villain. The toxicology results were staggering. The levels of seconal and methaqualone in her liver were massive, but the report also noted the presence of cocaine and PCP. It was a death by excess. She hadn't just overdosed, she had been obliterated. The medical examiner noted that the sheer volume of depressants in her system would have killed a man twice her weight. She had built up a tolerance that could only be achieved through sustained systematic abuse, facilitated by a supply chain that never ran dry. The police investigation, led by the Oceanside Department, but quickly expanding to Los Angeles, pivoted from accidental death to criminal negligence. They weren't looking for a street dealer on a corner. They were looking for the source of the prescription pads. The trail was short and direct. In Anissa's purse and in the apartment she shared with her brother, detectives found the amber vials with their clinically typed labels. They all bore the same name, Dr. Don Moschos. The pursuit of Dr. Moschos became a proxy war against the entire culture of Dr. Feelgoods, the network of physicians who operated in the strip malls and medical plazas of Los Angeles, catering to the wealthy, the famous, and the desperate. Moschos was not an anomaly. He was an industry standard. But Anissa Jones was not an anonymous junkie. She was a national symbol. The political pressure to find a scapegoat was immense. When investigators raided Moschos' office in Torrance, the banality of the evil was striking. It was a sterile, fluorescent-lit medical practice. The files seized by the police painted a picture of staggering malpractice. Moschos had prescribed Anissa over 4,000 pills in the months leading up to her death. There were no notes on therapy, no referrals to addiction specialists, no attempts to taper her dosage. There was only a relentless stream of Seconal, supplied on demand to a teenage girl who was clearly spiraling. The state charged Moschos with 11 felony counts, including illegally prescribing controlled substances and second-degree murder. The murder charge was an aggressive, unprecedented legal maneuver. Prosecutors were attempting to establish a new precedent that a doctor's pen could be a murder weapon. The trial was a sordid affair. The defense strategy was predictable and cruel, portraying the 18-year-old victim as a manipulative, sophisticated addict who had duped a well-meaning doctor. They tried to put Buffy on trial, while the jury eventually convicted Moschos of illegally prescribing drugs. The murder charge did not stick. He was sentenced to probation and lost his medical license. He walked away a disgraced man, but he walked away. While the legal battle raged, the industry that had profited from Anissa's rise sought to distance itself from her fall. CBS issued perfunctory statements of regret, but accepted no institutional responsibility. The silence was deafening. The audience moved on to Happy Days and 8 is Enough, looking for new avatars of perfection. The industry moved on to new revenue streams. In the vacuum left by the industry's indifference, the Jones family imploded. The public vitriol directed at Mary Paula Jones was relentless. She was cast as the ultimate villain, the pushy stage mother who had sacrificed her daughter to the god of fame. She retreated into seclusion, living out the rest of her life in the shadow of the tragedy she had helped author. Paul Jones was the collateral damage that the cameras ignored. He was Anissa's shadow, the other half of the broken home. When Anissa died, Paul didn't just lose a sister. He lost the only person who understood the specific strange trauma of their upbringing. Paul's decline was a slow-motion echo of Anissa's. He inherited the remaining money. He inherited the grief. And he inherited the vulnerability to the same predators who had circled his sister. 8 years later, on March 15, 1984, Paul died of a drug overdose. He was 24. The erasure of the Jones children was complete. The curse of family affair became a popular tabloid trope in the years that followed. Sebastian Cabot, the beloved Mr. French, died of a stroke in 1977, just a year after Anissa. Brian Keith, the rugged paternal Uncle Bill, survived the longest. But he too was hounded by tragedy. He endured the suicide of his own daughter, Daisy, in 1997. 2 months later, in a final act of despair and control, Brian Keith took his own life. The funeral for Anissa Jones was a private affair. There were no cameras allowed. There was no lying in state. The industry that had made millions off her image sent flowers, but few executives attended. Her body was cremated. The ashes were taken out to sea. Off the coast of the California beaches, where she had briefly found solace as a teenager, Anissa Jones was scattered into the Pacific. There is no headstone. There is no monument. There is only the ocean. Her legacy, however, lingered in a way she never intended. Her death forced a conversation about the treatment of child stars and the predatory nature of the doctors who circled the industry. By the mid-1980s, the landscape of television had changed. The industry created stricter block trust funds, updated Coogan accounts to ensure that child stars couldn't access their entire fortune the second they turned 18. It was a financial patch on a psychological wound, but stripped of the sociology and the history, the story is simply about a girl who wanted to be loved. Anissa Jones spent her short life looking for affection. She looked for it in her mother and found a manager. She looked for it in the audience and found consumers. She looked for it in drugs and found death. The tragedy is not that she died young. The tragedy is that she never really got to live. From age 8 to age 13, she was Buffy. From age 13 to age 18, she was the ex-Buffy. She was never just Anissa. In the end, Mrs. Beasley, the doll that Anissa carried for 5 years, the symbol of her fame, ended up in a museum. It is preserved behind glass, smiling that eternal stitched-on smile. Anissa Jones is dust in the water. The product survived. The person did not.